When Ben Franklin was leaving the last day of the Constitutional Convention at the back door of Independence Hall, he was stopped by a lady. I've recounted this story for you before. And she asked, "Well, Mr. Franklin, do we have a republic?" He looked at her and said, "You have one if you can keep it." And whether or not they could keep it came down to a lot of things, but primarily it came down on the shoulders of one man, the broad shoulders of George Washington, who by this time was already a myth. And this was before he started his presidency, a journey upon which he reluctantly embarked. Everybody knew at the Constitutional Convention that the man who would be the first chief executive in the history of this country and perhaps of the world was going to be George Washington. Whether he wanted it or not, that's debatable. But whether this country could have survived without him, that's probably not debatable. George Washington is truly the father of his country. And we're going to take a look at his first 2 terms as president and the many things he had to do to steer this country and the Constitution on the proper path.
Washington was called in Philadelphia to write the nation's constitution. This would lay the foundations for an independent America. Although retired, Washington knew it was his duty to attend.
Washington was most reluctant to attend the Constitutional Convention for a number of reasons. But perhaps the biggest reason of all is he knew that he had such tremendous prestige that he could bring to this convention. And he did not want to blow that prestige by coming to a convention that might fail.
He was unanimously elected president of the Constitutional Convention, attended every session, conducted it with honor and integrity. He didn't speak much during the convention itself, but I still think his influence was very significant and his presence absolutely essential.
Washington's presence shaped a new republic. The convention decided the nation should be led by one man, a president.
The debate sometimes got quite awkward because people were talking about creating this presidency and would this president someday become a tyrant, and there standing right in front of them was Washington, who would become the first president.
But it was with a heavy heart that he accepted the presidency. In April 1789, he left for his inauguration in New York.
I bade adieu to Mount Vernon, to private life and to domestic felicity, and with a mind oppressed by more anxious and painful sensation than I have words to express, set out to render service to my country in obedience to its call, but with less hope of answering its expectations.
Washington both desires fame and fears failure. So he wants to be in the spotlight, but he's already got his reputation. And a very strong part of him does not want to become president. Why risk the reputation you have on an extremely difficult position, yet alone the fact that he wants to be at Mount Vernon? He's getting old. Washington's life was not his own when his country demanded it, and he could not, as a patriot, refuse the call of duty if it was clear and unmistakable. And so time and time again, he answers that call, even at significant and great personal sacrifice.
He was the leader of a new country with no money, inexperienced government, and few foreign allies.
When Washington became president, he said, "The eyes of Argus are upon us, and everything we do are going to be carefully scrutinized." And he said, because it's the beginning, little things we do which might not seem of importance will set precedents. And it's really remarkable as you look back, considering the untried ground that he went over, how wise he was over and over again in the decisions he made.
After 4 difficult years as president, he resolved to resign. But America was still fragile, and he was persuaded to stay for a second term.
Turns out to be a very, very heavy burden that took a tremendous toll on him, and he lost a lot of his personal freedom, which he desperately wanted, in order to achieve what was to him an even greater goal.
13 quarrelsome little colonies, each with their own agenda, had to be brought together, and Washington was the only man who could do it. He had become the embodiment of the new America, and as such, became a target for criticism whenever anything went wrong.
Well, Washington did not cope with criticism very well. He was a very demanding man, and he was, in some respects, insecure. And he was a very unforgiving man. And anybody who questioned his actions really became an enemy of Washington's. He turned against them.
After 8 years as president, he determined to leave public life for good. Old, tired, and desperately disillusioned, he dug out the farewell address he had written 4 years previously.
Washington was only in his early 60s when he gives up the office of the presidency after serving 2 terms. But I want to backtrack for a second to a couple things that were said. Number one, Washington's ego. Yeah, he had one. Sometimes it was a positive, and at other times, an ego, of course, with everybody, can be a negative. In this case, there were people who knew how to play him. And what I mean by that is he was afraid that if he went to the Constitutional Convention and it failed, that his reputation would be sullied. And of course, there were others like James Madison and particularly Alexander Hamilton who knew how to play Washington. They appealed to that very ego by saying that if it failed and he didn't come, he would be blamed. So Washington goes to the convention, knowing full well that he's probably going to be put in charge of the convention as the president running the meetings, which of course he was, as you heard in the film, unanimously. What does he bring to the table? Well, he brings that reputation. He's not a particularly brilliant man. He doesn't come up with any great ideas that are going to mold or shape the Constitution. He's not a persuasive public speaker. But again, it's that reputation of honesty, stick-to-itiveness, and again, the hero of the revolution that is going to influence everything that's going to happen at that convention. He does a lot of work behind the scenes in the dinner meetings and in the evenings after the convention adjourns for the day. He will buttonhole people. He will talk them. He will persuade. He will cajole and get them to do the right thing. And even when it comes time to ratify the Constitution, particularly in his home state of Virginia, again, behind the scenes, he exerts a lot of influence to guarantee the acceptance of the Constitution by the crucial state of Virginia. So Washington has a lot to do with everything that's going to happen, again, because of the strength of his personality and of his reputation. So here is a man who, again, led by balance, not by brilliance. He was always pretty much even-keeled. He had a number of, by his own admission, personal flaws. In particular, had a legendary temper, and he worked day and night to control that, starting when he was in his teens. And consequently, he always gave that stiff appearance to a lot of people. But it was him fighting to keep his emotions in check. And when they did bubble over, it shocked people and had actually at times a positive effect. You see the statement that he makes there, I walk upon untrodden ground. He was wise enough to know, being the first president under this Constitution, everything he was going to do would be under the lens of a microscope. And he would be setting precedent. He would be setting examples. Of course, myth surrounds him. Much of the myth will be publicized by his biographer, a gentleman by the name of Parson Weems, who writes the biography of Washington in 1830s, long after Washington has passed away. And Weems never personally knew Washington. But the myth of him trying to throw a silver dollar across the Delaware, if anybody could do that today, they'd be automatically signed to a multi-million-dollar contract, either with the NFL or with Major League Baseball. So no, he didn't throw a silver dollar across the Delaware. First of all, they didn't make silver dollars. And of course, chopping down the cherry tree, confronted by his father, I cannot tell a lie. Well, of course, we didn't have cherry trees. They were donated by Japan, and that's how they became endemic to the United States. But more about that later. So, the myth of Washington, one of the myths that only recently has been debunked, was his size. People had him, and I would readily admit that in past lectures I portrayed him as 6'4", a giant among men. Well, he was a giant, but he wasn't 6'4". He was 6 foot. But again, in a country where the average height was between 5'5" and 5'7", that was a giant. And the way he carried himself added to that image. When all of this happens, the Constitution, preceded by Shays' Rebellion, and then his push to the presidency, Washington says this: "In confidence, I tell you, with the world it would obtain little credit, that my movements to the chair of government will be accomplished by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." Again, Washington displays this duality. Part of him dreads the experience, and the other part craves the spotlight. And just as when he wore his uniform to the Second Continental Congress, and of course would be appointed as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, so too he knows that he's going to be chosen as president.
On April 6, 1789, the ballots of the presidential electors were officially counted in the new United States Senate. As expected, George Washington became the first president of the United States under the new Constitution. Americans everywhere greeted the news with great joy, but Washington remained unexcited. Calling his election the event which I have long dreaded, Washington described his feelings as not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. Although Washington had high hopes for the new Constitution, he did not know if it would work as intended. "I am bringing the voice of the people and a good name of my own on this voyage, but what returns will be made of them, heaven alone can foretell." Despite his doubts and frustrations with the 10,000 embarrassments, perplexities, and troubles of the presidency, the new president retained his faith in the American people. He explained that nothing but harmony, honesty, industry, and frugality are necessary to make us a great and happy people. We are surrounded by the blessings of nature.
Now, let's stop there for a second and let's deal with a couple of things concerning newer interpretations of George Washington. First of all, was he a slaveholder? Absolutely. When he marries Martha Washington, who at that time was Martha Custis, he owned approximately 30 slaves of his own. But when he marries Martha, she brings to the table a couple hundred. And by the time of Washington's death, he was one of the larger slaveholders in Virginia with over 300 slaves. Was he a brutal master? Well, there are varying interpretations of that. Some say yes. Others point to examples of him beating and whipping. He brought slaves with him to the presidency. Ironically, when the capital was moved to Philadelphia, there was a law in Pennsylvania which said after 6 months, Slaves had to be freed. Well, what Washington did was bring his uh, slaves with him, one of the most famous being a gentleman by the name of Hercules and his own personal chef. But before the 6 month period hit, he would move them back to Virginia, have them stay there for a month, bring them back, and the clock would start all over again. He had one or two slaves escape, and he put an ad in the paper, one of which said that they would be paid extra, uh, anybody that caught them and beat them. So he does display a callous side. However, Washington struggled with the concept of slavery, particularly in regards to the two documents that now define America, the Declaration of Independence, and of course, this new Constitution. And he put in his will upon his death and the death of Martha that all of his slaves were to be freed. So again, he struggled with the concept. He obviously was a man of his times, growing up in the first slave state, Virginia. But as time wore on, he began to question the efficacy and the morality of the peculiar institution. As was said when he took the oath of office as the most admired man in America, one of his friends said, "Of all men, you are best fitted to fill that office." He was unanimously elected by the new Electoral College. Now, let's talk for a second just about the Electoral College. Understand its purpose. Remember, one of the fears of the people who were writing the Constitution was democracy running amok. Uh, it's more like uh, you know, Democrats go wild, calendar to follow. Well, what they were afraid of is the average person could not pick a good person to be president. And recent events might tend to support that idea. But be that as it may, now what you have is a safeguard. The people will vote for the electors, but the electors could defy the will of the people and vote who they wanted into office. And that was the original purpose of the Electoral College. So, April 30th, 1788, elected president of the United States, 69 to nothing. And then when he is sworn in, these words will create the most powerful office in the history of the world. Do you swear that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of your ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States? Washington says, "I do," and then adds the words, "So help me God." That was not part of the prescribed answer to that question. He adds it. And now he's going to have to give this role substance. He's going to have to flesh it out. But he starts doing that before he takes the oath of office in New York City. What he does is, instead of going by boat to New York City and getting there, from Virginia to New York City, would take them a little over a week. He will ride in a carriage from Mount Vernon to New York City, and it's going to take him over a month. Why? Well, the answer is simple. He wanted the people to see him. He realizes he is the visible symbol of this new nation. And eventually, throughout his 8 years as president, he will visit practically every state in the Union. Again, realizing its importance, that he be seen, that he be heard. He is going to stop in Philadelphia, where he is given a hero's welcome. He will stop in Trenton and Princeton, scene of two of his greatest military victories during the Revolution. And when he reaches the coast of New Jersey to be rowed over onto Manhattan Island, they will give him a white barge gilded in gold, showing respect and perhaps, in some people's minds, going a little bit overboard. But be that as it may, Washington will now be sworn in as president.
Yeah, we are ready to administer the oath of office, sir.
George Washington.
I am at your service.
Adams had already been sworn in as vice president. Watch and listen very closely. And swearing him in as the governor of New York, Livingston, Robert Livingston.
General, if you will please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I, George Washington, do solemnly swear.
I, George Washington, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability,
To the best of my ability.
preserve, protect, and defend
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States. So help me, God.
It is done. God bless George Washington, President of the United States.
Now, Washington and Adams do not make a great team, if you will, and we'll talk more about that later. The man who swore Washington in, Livingston, expects a job in the new government. Washington does not give him one. And consequently, as the governor of New York, he becomes Washington's enemy, as we'll see later on, in a problem with the French. And of course, now Washington's got to figure out what to do. He's just been sworn in as president, which means exactly what? You'll notice that Washington, when taking the oath of office, could barely be heard. People attributed that to his modesty, when in fact, what had happened was because of that 1 month journey. He was giving speech after speech after speech. He was thoroughly hoarse and had no voice left when he took the oath of office. Later, they would adjourn after the swearing in ceremony. He would meet briefly with what congressmen had been able to get to New York at this point in time, talk to them for about an hour, and then that was it. He would go back to the residence in New York City that had been set aside for him by himself.
Yeah,
Now, in terms of looking to guidance as to what to do, well, there wasn't many places you could look to. You look to the states and how they had set up their chief executive, their governors, if you will. And governors had, in most cases, little power. They were in for only a short period of times, some as long as just 1 year. And under the Articles of Confederation, remember, there was no executive whatsoever because their fear of a king. And the only reason there was one this time was because they knew it was going to be Washington. When you stop and think about it, that's really kind of short-sighted on their part because obviously somebody's going to come after Washington. So it was preordained that Washington would be president. But was not preordained is, what do we call him? Now, it may sound like a minor point, but the man himself was viewed by many as a deity. Now, that deity, if you will, has an office. This is what was proposed by John Adams in the United States Senate to call him. As we all know, Kamala Harris is as vice president under Biden. She is the president of the Senate. She runs the meetings. Well, John Adams, as I had mentioned earlier, had already been sworn in as president or vice president, and he was running the Senate before Washington was even sworn in. And they were debating on what to address him as. So Adams preferred His Highness, the President of the United States of America and protector of the rights of the same. Well, that's a mouthful. And when Washington got wind of this, he was outraged. He did not want to have the office sanctified. And he will prefer to be called exactly what we call the president today, Mr. President, the first citizen, if you will.
As the debate continues, the vote in the remaining states is considered too close to call.
New Hampshire is very closely divided, probably has an anti-federalist majority initially. Virginia, very evenly balanced. New York, there's a dominant anti-federalist majority. North Carolina, a dominant anti-federalist majority. And Rhode Island just rejects the Constitution, not by convention, but by popular referendum. What happened really turned on a decision in January 1788, where the Massachusetts Convention said they ratify, but with the assumption that there will be a Bill of Rights, and that was followed by subsequent ratifying conventions. So in a way, the acceptance of it was contingent on a Bill of Rights, and it was understood that that would, by the time New Hampshire ratified in June 1788, which was the 9th state, by that time it was understood there would be a Bill of Rights.
With 9 states signed on, the first election under the Constitution is scheduled for the early months of 1789. Will their design for a national government actually work?
The first session of the first Congress is a creative force in our constitutional life for 2 reasons. First, because the Bill of Rights was submitted in the House, written by Madison, digested from 85 recommendations from the states for rights, and drawn down into this Compact 10. And secondly, because the Judiciary Act was passed, which in 1789 created our federal judicial system. On top of all of that,
Still, once even that was done, the system was not complete until Washington's administration put it all into effect.
George Washington had no designs on continued power. He didn't want to be a dictator. He wanted to return to private life. And it was only the responsibility that fell to him that drew him out of private life. And so the fact that Washington would be the first president made the presidency seem much more palatable.
Washington knew that some kind of cabinet structure would be necessary. And he very consciously created such a group with powerful figures. And then he had to work out what the president's procedures would be with respect to the other branches of government.
Relations with the Senate are undoubtedly the most challenging for the country's first president.
Now, after Washington takes the oath of office, he has no idea what to do. I mean, literally, he goes back to the house that they gave him by himself. Of course, he has his quote unquote servants with him, but that's it. Martha has not yet arrived. There is no Secret Service to guard him. There's no police force to protect him. And a lot of times when you knocked on the door, he would answer. And there were a lot of knocks at this time because there were people angling for jobs in the new administration. You didn't have all the congressmen there yet. Remember, travel was very difficult back then. So the Senate had enough for a quorum, enough to have a legal meeting, but the House of Representatives, as of yet, did not. Remember, there was no executive offices yet that had been set up. He's the president, but there were no secretaries of state, secretary of treasury, chief justice of the Supreme Court, none of that. So this was all starting out. So again, I ask you the question, what do you do as the first president without any guidance? And it would be up to him to chart that course. So, as the first, whatever he does, remember, sets precedent. And again, the important thing is he realized that. So, as you just heard in the short film clip, the idea of a presidential cabinet started with him. Now, don't misunderstand. All of the executive agencies were set up at that time. Now, more would be added later. But Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, there was no Secretary of Defense at that particular time, the Attorney General of the United States. They were all established within the Constitution. He had to fill them out. But there was nothing that said that he was supposed to meet with them. It simply said in the Constitution that he should require from time to time in writing the various opinions of the executive branches. He decided, I don't want to do all that reading. Let's just bring them all together where he could seek their counsel and bounce ideas off them. Hence, the cabinet. He was against getting involved in foreign affairs too deeply. Later, that became a precedent, not necessarily the one that he was looking to establish, of no entangling alliances. And that will be voiced in his farewell address. So, for this new nation. What are they? Well, number one, he's got to live up to the promise that secured much of the support that was being withheld to the Constitution by getting a Bill of Rights included in the new Constitution, the first 10 amendments. As you already heard, James Madison, pictured there, was the author of this document. And he submitted 12 to 13 amendments. 10 were eventually approved, and it is Washington that will sign them into law after they are approved by the individual states. But there are other trouble spots. First of all, take a look at that. What's one of the first things he's got to do? just looking at the map. And it's something that is set up by the Constitution. And that is something that takes place every 10 years. We just had one. That's right, a census. He and they, the government, had no idea who was where, how many. And particularly as we've expanded all the way to the eastern shore of the Mississippi River, who was out there? What was out there? So the census was going to provide answers to that. And of course, it is with the census that we apportion representatives. And this is going to become a key point during this time period. But there's more problems. You've got the Spanish controlling the Mississippi River, which is the highway for Middle America at this time. You have the British down in Florida. And you've got British forts, which by the Treaty of Paris, 1783, were not supposed to be there. But until the United States paid their debts, they argued, they're not leaving. So he brings together a cabinet of superstars: Jefferson, Hamilton, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, John Jay as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You will notice that all great presidents surround themselves with great men. They are not afraid of being eclipsed, unlike a recent resident in the White House.
The United States, this newest of nations, ushered in a new government in 1789. George Washington was elected unanimously as the first president. John Adams was the vice president. As the chief executive, Washington surrounded himself with very able men. He appointed Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State, Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General, and John Jay as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. James Madison, a member of the House of Representatives, worked as a speechwriter for Washington. During his first term in office, Washington joined the states together and helped establish the federal government.
The problem with this group of men is they didn't always necessarily agree on anything. Alexander Hamilton becomes the brilliant Secretary of the Treasury and perhaps dealt with the most crushing problems, and that was the nation's lack of credit and its tremendous debt. Hamilton, of course, I don't know if any of you saw the play or the film on Disney Plus. If not, you should. It's an excellent recapitulation of his life. Hamilton, many people felt, was the prime mover in Washington's administration. And it is true that Washington looked upon him and the Marquis de Lafayette as surrogate sons, if you will. And Washington agreed with much of what Hamilton was going to attempt to do. But this was going to lead to the rise of political parties. Two men become the polar opposites, attracting individuals to them: Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson, Secretary of State, who was already over in Paris, and Washington kind of put pressure on him to come back and accept the post. And of course, now Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. If one said the sky was blue, the other one would say it was yellow. They agreed on virtually nothing. As you go down the list that you see there on the screen, you see that they were in totally opposite corners. And the government tended to divide itself that way. Washington was somewhat politically naive to think that whatever problems they had could be worked out, and they'd be worked out in public.
You must find Philadelphia much changed.
Hamilton.
More change than I could have imagined.
That's Jefferson.
Mr. Hamilton. Not the city itself. All cities follow everything in their way. That's no surprise to me. That's why I abhor them. But I've been, as you know, in revolutionary France, where the streets are filled with the songs of liberty and brotherhood and the overthrow of ancient tyrannies of Europe, and to return from there to this, our cradle of revolution, and find the dinner table chatter is all of money and banks and authority is an unwelcome surprise.
Unwelcome, perhaps, but necessary.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
Willingness of other nations to lend us money. So you had a Southern slaveholder and a New York financier arguing what was the future going to look like. Would it be through trade and commerce, or would it be through Jefferson's eyes, where he views an agricultural America, an agrarian society? Jefferson hires a gentleman by the name of Philip Freneau to a non-existent job in the State Department. Freneau's job really was one thing: to publish an anti-Hamilton newspaper. The National Gazette, as it was called, was the Fox News of its day. And it was Freneau's job to put Hamilton under his microscope and criticize him either justly or unjustly, but nevertheless to criticize him. Now, what was Hamilton's main concern? Well, you remember in that little film clip, the credit of this country. There was not enough money for the government to operate, let alone pay its debts. So Madison and Hamilton, independently of one another, came up with two very different plans. And it would be the nexus of the disagreement that would eventually result in official political parties. Madison wanted taxing of imports from other countries, but there would be no national bank. Well, that is not the way Hamilton saw it. Hamilton's financial plan, which Washington had encouraged him to put together, would be over 500 pages in length, and Hamilton would write it all by himself. What Hamilton did, as portrayed in those cartoons, was, in certain respects, brilliant. Example: when the Revolutionary War was being fought, Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, issued bonds. That's how governments borrow. If you have a savings bond, for example, given to you when you were a little kid by grandmom and grandpop, that savings bond, let's say it's a $50 savings bond, they bought for $30. They lent the government $30 with the idea that eventually this bond would be worth $50, that they were getting, if you will, $20 worth of interest. Well, that is what most governments did and still do. And that is how they paid to get money lent to them by individuals, or how they gave bonds to Revolutionary War officers or soldiers in lieu of giving them a salary. Well, eventually, to most people, those bonds became essentially worthless. And so what they did was they sold those bonds to speculators who said, listen, I'll give you $1 for your $10 bond. Well, that's $1 more than they had, so they took it. But now Hamilton says those debts that we incurred by issuing bonds, we need to pay off at face value if we are to be given a good credit rating. And so what he did was, those speculators who had bought the bonds for $1, he paid them the $10 for those bonds. Well, of course, the people who sold them for $1 felt like they were cheated. And of course, the wealthy speculators felt themselves more aligned with the government, which is exactly what Hamilton wanted to do. And then on the other hand, Hamilton goes a step further. He says, not only are we going to pay off the national government debt, he proposes that because each state incurred debt in fighting the Revolution for America, that it should be the national government that pays off the state debts. And of course, what that would do would automatically align the individual states with the national government. Well, some states, Virginia being one of them, were upset with that. They had already paid off their debt. So what are they getting out of it? And then the coup de grace in Hamilton's plan was the creation of an entity to handle all of this money going in and out. And that would be the Bank of the United States, modeled after the Bank of England. That would give us stable monetary policy and make our credit rating continue to go up. Well, his proposal was going to be complicated by the Pennsylvania Quakers. Those that were in Congress wanted to add to that bank or add to that bill a tack on, if you will. And what they tacked on was a proposal, twofold. One, that the capital of the United States should be permanently placed in Philadelphia, which for many made sense. It was midway between North and South. And secondly, they proposed that slavery be declared illegal and that all slaves would be freed within a certain time period. Well, this, of course, automatically upset and electrified the South. So no movement was made on Hamilton's financial plan. Eventually, the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, would hold a dinner meeting at his apartment in New York. He invites Madison and Hamilton, and there was no food, but plenty of wine was drunk at that meeting. And a compromise was worked out. The deal was this, that the nation's capital would be moved to the south, to the place that we now know as Washington, D.C. And that in return for that, there would be an assumption of the nation's or of the state's debt by the national government, with the caveat that Hamilton put pressure on George Washington to serve a second term. And lastly, they agreed to accept, in principle, the Bank of the United States. So, the deal, the nation's capital in the South, still run the government by a slaveholder, George Washington, and that the states would have their debts assumed by the national government, and there would be a Bank of the United States. Jefferson was not thrilled with the bank bill. As he told Washington, it was a step beyond the boundaries drawn around the powers of Congress, and it is unauthorized by the Constitution. But on the other hand, Hamilton argues that Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause, implies that the Constitution establishes the idea that you can do what is ever necessary for the government to do its job. This becomes known as the elastic clause because it stretches, it elasticizes the government's power. And that is how it gets through Congress. But how are we going to get the money to pay for all this? Well, Hamilton proposes putting a tax on whiskey. Western farmers are furious with this. And in 1794 begins the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, the tax on whiskey is what today we call a sales tax. Back then it was called an excise tax. Regardless, Western farmers were dependent upon alcohol, not for their own drinking, but for sale, because to get their crops from across the Allegheny Mountains to the east to sell was extremely difficult at that time. So it was easier to take 10 bushels of corn or wheat and make it into 1 gallon of whiskey, because the 1 gallon of whiskey on the back of a horse carried over would be easier, and it sold for a higher price. But now that was going to be added to. When one of Washington's appointed collectors, who happened to be a personal friend, was tarred and feathered, Washington was furious, and he was not going to put up with this challenge of the government's authority. So he raises an army of 15,000. He personally will lead that army for a few miles. Hamilton will lead it the rest of the way. And they are sent to Western Pennsylvania. And thus, the Whiskey Rebellion is put down, as one individual said, by using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. The leaders of this rebellion are taken to Philadelphia, where they were going to be put on trial. Washington pardons each and every one of them. But the point has been made. Unlike Shays' Rebellion, which saw a government powerless to deal with it, this was not going to be the case. The Constitution was going to be the supreme law of the land.
Now I'm really angry. This is fucking war.
So, Washington puts down the revolution.
As the United States government worked at solving its problems with France and Britain, trouble developed at home in the normally peaceful farm country of western Pennsylvania and Kentucky. People in these areas raised wheat, corn, and rye, and they used some of the grain to make whiskey. It was perfectly legal to make whiskey, but U.S. law said that persons who did so had to pay a tax. In fact, tax on alcohol was an important source of income for the federal government back in the 1790s. But many farmers refused to pay the tax. They even committed violence against the federal tax collectors, setting off what has come to be called the Whiskey Rebellion. To put an end to the rebellion, President Washington sent 15,000 U.S. troops into the region. This large show of force soon convinced the farmers to pay the taxes. And the rebels also were required to sign the document seen here, in which they agreed to respect the laws of the United States. And so, by taking swift military action against the Whiskey Rebellion, the American government made it clear that it would not tolerate activities that violated national laws.
Now, this all takes place mainly during Washington's second administration. And one of the problems that had reared its ugly head during his first term of office was the French Revolution. And it would be over this issue that would solidify the raising of political parties in America. Democratic Republicans, sometimes known as Jeffersonians, and the other party, the Federalist Party. In France, 2 heroes of the American Revolution would be imprisoned. Thomas Paine, author, of course, of Common Sense, and the Marquis de Lafayette, again, looked upon by Washington as his surrogate son. And so the American people were split as to the French Revolution and the aftermath of that revolution. The rise of political parties would come as a result of that. Jefferson, of course, was very pro-French and very pro-French Revolution. as he would later say, every now and then the grounds of revolution and democracy must be watered with a little blood. Whereas the Federalist Party looked more towards a more stable English model of government and saw runaway democracy and what it was doing in France and in the rest of Europe. So began Washington's second term of office.